My name is Joel, I'm 46 years old, and I've been a pastor for almost a decade. I grew up in the Carapicuiba region, but it was in Osasco that my story truly began and perhaps also ended. Many people know me as a man of God, a liberator of souls, a voice from heaven on earth, but no one imagines what I carried beneath my robe for all these years. No one imagines the price I paid to bring fire down on that altar. The church, called Restoration, began small, in a rented hall in Jardim Rosedale, near the Varsha field and the old state school. In 2001, it was just me, my wife Mile, about 10 plastic chairs, and Faith, but in less than 2 years, the church grew at a supernatural pace, and when I say supernatural, I'm not exaggerating. I know what I'm talking about. I remember well the smell of the raw wood when we installed the new pulpit. The walls were painted with paint donated by a brother in the community. There's the altar I prepared myself. At the time, I said it was anointed. Today I know it was consecrated, just not in the way everyone thinks. The services were noisy, fervent, and packed. People came from all over Osasco, even Baruri and Itatvi. They said the power of God descended, and indeed, something did. People fell to the ground, screamed, vomited, spoke in tongues. It was beautiful to see. It was frightening, too, but no one questioned whether it was a spiritual manifestation or something from God. I got used to seeing demon-possessed people crawling on the floor, brothers trembling like leaflets, objects falling by themselves. The sisters in the prayer circle cried, clapped, and cried out. There was one service where the cross blinked 3 times by itself. I swear to God, at the time, I said, it's the Spirit manifesting itself, but deep down, I was already beginning to suspect that it wasn't exactly him. Mile, my wife, had always been quieter. She would sit in the front rows, her veil neatly draped over her head, hands folded in her lap, eyes closed. She prayed incessantly. Sometimes I'd catch her looking at me with a kind of sadness on her face that bothered me. It wasn't contempt, it was as if she knew something but wouldn't say it. I told myself it was all the fruit of my dedication, that it was my fasting, my surrender, my anointing, but deep down, something tugged at me, and every time I entered the pastoral office alone and saw the reflection of my face in the window, I avoided looking too closely, because my eyes didn't look the same as before, which almost no one knows. In fact, only me and one other person know. The thing is, before founding the church, I went to a forest in Koshia. I didn't go to pray. I was taken by a man named Silas. At the time, he was known in downtown Osasco as a man of gifts. He sold anointed oil, handkerchiefs of deliverance, books with revelations from God. But there was something strange about him, a drawn-out laugh, a penetrating gaze. We met on a cloudy morning at the bus terminal. He took me to a secluded place, with the smell of wet earth and smoke in the air. I remember I was trembling, but I went. He gave me a small knife, a red cloth, and a black rooster tied inside a bag. If you want people to fall over when you touch the microphone, you'll have to fall to your knees here now. He said it, and I did it. I buried the rooster with the words he told me to repeat. I felt dizzy, a burning in my chest, a nausea that almost made me vomit. When I opened my eyes, the ground seemed darker, the forest thicker, and Silas was no longer there, just a folded, dirty letter, written in shaky handwriting. He will answer you. 3 weeks later, I received an unexpected donation of 20 chairs. Then, a brother I'd never seen before showed up with a professional microphone and a complete sound system. The following month, a woman cured of cancer donated $1,000 in offerings, and so it went, and I said, "Glory to God." But the truth is, the glory wasn't exactly his. The church's fame spread quickly. A TV Osasco news report came to do a story, Pastor Joel, the man who cast out 40 demons in 1 week. I smiled during the interview, but inside I trembled, because I knew that if one day a demon decided to open their mouth, my ministry would end. At that time, people were talking a lot about Lunadiata. An episode had aired about a sect that performed rituals in the woods. Sister Cedar commented after the service, That devil thing was just like the one we see here, Pastor, only there it was the devil, here it's Jesus, right? I just smiled, but my hands were sweaty. I tried to make up for it with charity. I handed out food baskets, I prayed on the street, I visited prisons. It was as if I were trying to buy my innocence, but the more I gave, the more I felt something was watching me. Sometimes, in the early morning, I heard knocking on the roof. The sound of footsteps on the stone slab. Once, I heard my name whispered outside the window, Joel, with that dragging sound that still gives me chills. Camilla appeared at the church in 2002, at the age of 23, ex-addict, with a sweet voice, sad eyes. She gave her life to Christ during a Thursday service. She had a light in her, but also a fragility, and when she began to sing in the praise song, the people wept. They said they felt the presence, but I felt something else. I shouldn't have looked at her the way I did, but I did. At first, I condemned myself, then justified myself with foolish arguments. I'm helping, advising, caring, but I knew where this was going, and every pact has clauses. Mine was clear: never get attached, never get involved, never love. Mal noticed. She always notices. She never confronted me, but her look said everything. One night she served me coffee and asked without looking up, "Do you think everything that happens here is really from God?" I pretended not to hear, but my hands were shaking. The coffee spilled on the plate. I couldn't sleep well anymore. I dreamed of red eyes staring back at me in the mirror, of inverted crosses, of songs in languages I'd never heard. I woke up sweaty, out of breath, and pretended to be normal at breakfast, but each service was an internal war. I wanted to stop, but I knew that if I did, everything would fall apart. I continued preaching, shouting, expelling, fasting. On the outside, Pastor Joel was an example. On the inside, Joel was a hostage. Every round of applause from the church was a reminder, they have no idea who you really are, and each new visitor was another soul I placed before an altar that was no longer just mine. On that Sunday in February 2003, the church was full, people standing, fans whirring and echoing through the speakers. The service began like all the others, but what no one knew was that hell was coming to collect its share. That Sunday's service started hot, not only because of the presence of the people, but also because of the unbearable heat. It was almost 7 p.m., and the old ceiling fan was spinning slowly, groaning as if it were about to collapse. The smell of sweat, cheap perfume, and expired deodorant mingled with the myrrh incense that Sister Nia lit before the praises. The church was packed, over 100 people crammed into that simple hall, with cream-colored walls. I had already ascended the pulpit, holding the microphone with the confidence I'd trained over the years. The worship team was playing Cassin with all their might, with much praise, and Camilla was there in the front, eyes closed, voice steady, as if nothing had happened. She didn't know it, but ever since I dreamed of the Spirit collecting my debt, my gaze toward her had changed. It was fear, it was guilt. As I prayed in tongues with my eyes half closed, something in the back of the church distracted me. I heard a strange noise, as if someone were dragging a chair roughly against the floor. I opened my eyes and saw a man entering. He was barefoot. His pants were ripped, his shirt was dirty, his hair was matted, his skin stained with dirt and dried blood. It was as if he'd crawled out of a hole, literally. The stranger entered as if he were part of the service. He didn't speak to anyone, didn't ask for prayer, just sat in the last row and stood there, staring at the altar with wide eyes, unblinking. The people around him moved away, some made the sign of the cross, others began to murmur prayers. The smell he brought was unbearable. It wasn't just dirt, it was sulfur. It was as if someone had opened a hot pit in the middle of the nave. Sister Dalva began to shiver and fanned her face with the open Bible. "He's a beggar, Pastor," a young worker murmured. I didn't respond, just watched, but inside, my stomach turned. I had smelled that smell before. It was the same as the forest in Kosher on the Day of the Covenant, hot, putrid, metallic. The worship service ended, and Camilla returned to the pew. Her expression was strangely tense. I saw her turn discreetly and stare at the man in the back. She frowned as if she recognized something. For a moment, our eyes met. It was brief, but there was dread in her eyes, a fear that chilled my spine. I continued as if nothing had happened. I took the microphone and opened Mark chapter 5, the demoniac, the Gadarene. It was my favorite sermon for deliverance services. Ironic, now, I see. As I read the verse, I realized my voice was breaking. Even with the loud music, something was catching in my throat. The church was too quiet. It was as if everyone else was feeling the same discomfort. When I began the prayer, the man in the back stood up, his joints cracking, his legs trembling. He began walking toward me slowly. Each step he took seemed to make the floor creak. No one moved. Some children began to cry. A baby in Sister Maristla's arms cried so loudly he seemed to be panicking. It was as if he saw something the others couldn't. The man knelt near the third row. His shoulders shook. He began to cry or laugh. It was hard to tell. His head shook from side to side. His eyes rolled back. His mouth foaming. The sound coming from him wasn't human. It was a growl like a wounded animal. "Lord, have mercy," I heard someone whispering near the altar. I decided to step down. I grabbed the small white towel from the pulpit, wiped the sweat from my face, and walked slowly toward him. The heat was stifling. The yellowish light in the hall flickered. The sound was staticky. My feet seemed to sink into the floor. Each step hurt. When I faced him, the man lifted his face and smiled. That smile, I'll never forget. Yellow teeth, bleeding gums, bulging eyes, and a smell that rose like hot breath directly onto my face. "You came to kick me out, Pastor Joel," he whispered. I recoiled. No one knew my full name there. It was always Pastor Joel, but he pronounced it as if he'd known me forever. "Who are you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He laughed. "Do you know who I am? I was there. Remember the knife? Remember the rooster?" My heart raced, my eyes filled with tears, my legs shook. It was impossible. This wasn't happening. People began to stand up restlessly. Some said, "It's the devil." Others began to pray aloud in tongues, but it was different. Other possessions. This wasn't like the other cases. There was something deeper, more conscious. He wasn't there by chance. He came looking for it. "The time has come, Joel," he said, his voice now deeper. "You haven't done your part." I tried to order, "In the name of Jesus, be quiet," but the sentence came out weak, choked. The man laughed. The laughter echoed in the room as if coming from all sides. A plastic cup exploded on the floor. The lamp in the hallway burst with a sharp pop. Sister Na fell to her knees, crying. Brother Leandro began to tremble. The atmosphere grew dense. The air was heavy, unbreathable. It felt like the ceiling was going to collapse. "I've come to show you who you are, Pastor," he growled. "Enough lying, enough pretending. They need to know," and pointed his finger at me, a dirty finger. The nail broken like claws, and what he said next froze my entire body. "You're not a pastor at all, you're mine, and now everyone will know." His voice was clear, without hesitation. This wasn't possession, it was judgment, a spiritual tribunal, and I was the defendant. Kamala screamed. She fell to the floor and began to struggle. Sister Mal ran to her, shouts, "Run!" I tried to climb back to the pulpit, but my legs gave out. I held on to the side of the pew and stood there motionless. My world spun, my lies coming to the surface. That man, or whatever he was, slowly stood up, his eyes still fixed on me, and in a calm, almost gentle tone, he said, "This is just the beginning, Joel. You called me, now hold on." And he fell again, unconscious. The hall fell silent, a silence dense, heavy, like smoke. No one applauded, no one prayed. The service had ended, but hell was just beginning. I stood there, my hands still resting on the pew, feeling the sweat drip down my back, and my shirt stuck to my body. The lights still flickered and the sound was off. The air smelled of melted candles and burnt flesh. The silence was absolute. The only sound was a child crying in the background, but very softly, as if even she was afraid of making too much noise. A man lay on the altar floor, panting, but his eyes were open, wide, fixed on the ceiling. I thought he had passed out, but when Sister Lucia tried to approach with a glass of water, he sat up in a quick, jerky movement, like a puppet being pulled by invisible strings. The water dropped from her hand, the sister recoiled in fright, covering her mouth with her hands. The man stood up slowly, his whole body trembling, but his gaze, was calm, too calm, and that's when he spoke. The voice wasn't his, it was another. It was thick, deep, as if it had come from inside a deep cave, muffled with echo. "This place is mine," he said, looking at the cross behind the altar, and as soon as the words left his mouth, the cross turned, spun on its own, stopped upside down. A collective groan filled the temple. People began to run away, others knelt down, crying. A brother fainted near the door. I took 2 steps back, but I couldn't take my eyes off the scene. The man was now walking toward the pulpit with slow steps, and each step seemed to weigh tons on the floor. The wood creaked, the atmosphere was suffocating, as if the air had grown thicker. It was hard to breathe. I heard someone vomit in the bathroom. He arrived at the pulpit and looked straight at me. "You called me, Pastor, you called me that night, you repeated every word, and now you want to kick me out." The whole church listened. The microphone was off, but his voice sounded like it was coming from the speakers. It echoed, it penetrated. "You promised not to love anyone." He slowly turned his face toward Kamla, who was still sitting on the floor, supported by 2 sisters. "But you touched her, touched what belonged to me, and now you're going to pay." Kamla's eyes widened. She put her hand to her mouth and began to cry desperately. She didn't know anything. I murmured weakly, without the courage to face anyone, but he ignored me. He continued walking up the altar now as if braiding, feeding on the panic in the room. And you, Mile." He pointed to my wife, who was on her knees, clutching her veil tightly. "You said a prayer, asked for the truth to come out." He laughed. "It was heard, but not by heaven." She screamed, a dry, muffled scream, and burst into tears. I tried to pray mentally, but my mind was a battlefield. No words formed. It was as if everything inside me had been swallowed by a shadow. I felt a strong nausea, almost fell again, but I needed to maintain the appearance of authority. I was still the pastor. I still needed to maintain control, even though control had already abandoned me. It was then that he revealed everything. Motel Jardins, where I committed the act on Tuesday. On that day Kamla wore a red dress, applied cheap perfume. "You cried after the act, remember?" Screams echoed through the church. An assistant fell to his knees, covering his ears. "You promised to follow the rules, not to love, not to get involved, and you broke everything. I gave you the temple, I gave you the power, I gave you the respect." The voice grew deeper, more charged. "And now you want to pretend you're a man of God?" The ground began to shake slightly. I don't know if it was real or psychological, but everything seemed to sway. The lamps flickered, and a high-pitched sound filled the room, a frequency so high it hurt my ears. Some people covered their ears and screamed, others were hypnotized, motionless. Kamala tried to get up, but fell. She cried without making a sound, only tears and silent sobs. A brother from the sound system began to pray loudly, and then the sound returned, a crack. The microphone turned on by itself. The devil's voice exploded through the speakers. "He serves me, and without me, he is nothing." I gripped the pulpit tightly, my hands trembling, the world spinning. I didn't know whether to get down, run, scream, or disappear, but I had dug that grave myself. Every brick in the church, every service, every miracle, everything was part of the pact, and now he exposed his guts in front of everyone. "They thought you healed, that you freed." The voice deepened even more, but I was the one operating. That sentence shattered any hope of pretense. I heard screams of despair. I saw brothers banging their heads. I saw a sister tearing out her own hair. "Joel, you no longer belong in heaven, you are mine." It was then that something fell from the ceiling. One of the speakers plummeted right next to the pulpit. It didn't hit anyone, but it was enough to cause widespread panic. People ran away, stumbling, hitting the pews. A man fell and lay motionless. The mother of a teenager screamed for help. The possessed man raised his arms and shouted, "It is done." And at that instant, he fell hard to the floor, as if the power had been turned off inside him. The church was silent for 5 seconds, which felt like 5 hours. The sound returned with a high-pitched hiss. Someone started a war chant, but no one followed. It was as if the room had been desecrated, as if everything inside had changed forever. The altar smelled burned, the cross still upside down. I couldn't move, I couldn't say anything, I couldn't pray. I just stood there with my head bowed, my hands cold, my heart racing, and the unbearable feeling that everyone in that room finally knew who I was. That service didn't end, it simply swallowed me up. There was no final blessing, no closing prayer, no exiting praise. People simply began to leave, staggering in shock, looking at each other as if they had survived an accident. It was as if the very floor of the church had spat out something rotten, and now no one knew how to deal with the taste that was left in their mouths. I was still at the altar, my hands sweating, my mind blank. The cross was still upside down, and although the possessed man, or whatever it was unconscious on the floor, the silence that filled the church was louder than any scream that had ever echoed inside. Sister Mile was sitting in the left corner, hugging her knees, her eyes sunken, staring blankly into space. Kamala had been taken to the bathroom by the sisters. The last image I had of her was her face red from crying so much, her hair plastered to her sweaty cheeks. She looked like a child in shock. It was then that I noticed 2 young teenagers from the church were filming. One of them had a cell phone with a camera. It was rare in 2003, but it did exist. It was one of those flip-top models, with low-quality images, but enough to capture the scene. The other, smarter, had a camcorder, a small one, the kind people used for birthdays. They recorded everything, from beginning to end. When I looked at them, I tried to make a plea with my eyes, something between stop and help me. But they stared at me with a mixture of fear and disappointment, like someone looking at a discovered father, a broken idol, and they continued filming. Sister Naya began cleaning the floor with rags. The altar still smelled of melted candles and something worse, a mixture of old blood and rust. The windows were open, but the air seemed trapped. No wind was coming in, only the hum of the ceiling fan, which had started up again and creaked as if laughing. Brother Leandro, the soundman, brought me a glass of water. I tried to grab it with my hand, but I dropped it. I was shaking. "Pastor, what was that?" he whispered. I didn't answer, I just looked into his eyes, and there, for the first time, I saw the beginning of the loss, the glow of the faith I'd blindly trusted fading. In the days that followed, the subject took over the neighborhood. Some said it was a satanic manifestation, others that it was a test from God, but most, only talked about me. The pastor had fallen, he had a lover, the devil revealed everything, lied to all of us. The versions multiplied. Every corner of Osasco seemed to know a new detail that even I no longer remembered. The video recorded at the service began circulating on cell phones via Bluetooth, then it appeared on pirated CDs at stalls along the Osasco boardwalk. A street vendor sold it as Pastor Joel's exorcism, real. It was my face there, my voice, my altar, my downfall. One of the young people in the church, outraged, uploaded an excerpt from the recording to an evangelical internet forum with the caption "False Prophet Exposed by Devil Inside the Service." Within 2 days, the story was already being discussed on MSN chain messages, in prayer groups, on local radio stations. A pastor friend of mine from Villa Iara called me at night. "Brother, what happened? Is it true?" I didn't know how to answer, so I just hung up. Mile went to sleep in the other room. Kamala stopped answering calls, and I wandered around the house like a ghost, waiting for the final blow. The following Wednesday, I tried to hold the deliverance service. Only 18 people showed up. Half were curious, the other half looked at me like someone looking at a criminal about to confess. The atmosphere in the church had changed. It was cold, dry, opaque. The screams had ceased. No one fell to the floor. No one cried. At the end of the service, an elderly man stood up and said loudly, "God is not a God of confusion," and he left. Others followed him. I was left alone at the altar, holding the Bible with the wax-stained pages. I knew I was losing everything, but part of me, Part of me already knew this was coming. The video reached my mother in Karapiku-Iba. She called me crying, "Son, is it true? Did you mess with the wrong guy?" I hung up without answering. Deep down, only one person could say that with certainty, Silas, but he had disappeared years ago. I started receiving threats, people saying they were going to destroy the church, protest, demand explanations. Some said they were going to report me for abuse of faith, others just wanted to see my face, see if I still had the courage to go up to the altar after that. Everything. I started wearing a cap and sunglasses. I avoided going out. Mal wouldn't talk to me anymore, wouldn't even look at me. Kamala disappeared. They said she went to an aunt's house in Diadema. A sister swore she saw her leaving with her suitcase at the bus station, crying. I couldn't confirm, but something told me she carried more than shame. The church woke up covered in graffiti, a devil's pastor, a liar, Joel, Judas. The front gate had been kicked in, the back kitchen window was broken. Some said it was vandalism, but I knew better. It wasn't just that, it was the spirit of the covenant demanding its presence. I thought about closing the church. I thought about running away, leaving, erasing everything, disappearing from everyone's sight. But every time that idea arose, a voice whispered in the darkness of my room, "You still have things to accomplish." The following Sunday, I preached again. Only 7 people were there, 7, and yet one of them fell to the floor, trembling, howling. There was no music, no screams, just that hoarse noise coming from the depths. "He's still mine," and in that moment, I understood, the demon that exposed me wasn't punishing me, he was marking me, he was reminding me that exposed or not, I was still trapped, and from that moment on, the world would no longer see Pastor Joel, but rather what was left of him. After the revelation service, Mal didn't say a word. She came home, calmly took off her shoes, went into her bedroom, and closed the door. She didn't lock it, she didn't yell, she didn't confront me. Her silence hurt more than any sermon she could preach. The absence of anger was worse than the fury. I stayed in the living room for hours, sitting on the burgundy sofa, staring at the wall. Arno's fan spun on the ceiling as usual, but it seemed slower. The television was off. The remote control in my hand trembled. Sweat trickled down the back of my neck. The house seemed to be breathing, but with a lack of air. In the early hours of the morning, I went to the kitchen and heard noise coming from her room. The door was ajar. Mal was kneeling beside the bed in her nightgown, hair loose, hands raised, but she wasn't praying aloud. She was murmuring, whispering words I couldn't understand. I approached silently. She said, "Show me, Lord, show me everything, reveal the rot, don't let the deception continue. Let everything come to light, even if it hurts." The words gave me chills. There was sincerity, but also anger, a pain that came from far away, from years of hiding. I returned to my room unseen, lay down, and pretended to sleep, but the image of her on her knees never left my mind. The problem was that I knew heaven was no longer listening to me, and I was afraid of what or who might be listening to her. 2 days later, Marley began having strange dreams. She told me about them dryly over breakfast. I dreamed of a completely dark room, only one windows. There was someone on the other side, but I couldn't see their face. They said to me, "Your request has been accepted, but the price will not be yours." She said it naturally, like someone commenting on a weather forecast, but there was something different in her eyes. There was no fear, there was determination. It was as if she had received an answer, and I, who knew the weight of words, knew immediately it was from heaven. In the following days, she began to pray more. Every morning, between 3 and 8 a.m., she would get up and go to the prayer room. I could hear her light footsteps, the creak of the chair, and the low sound of the Bible being leafed through, but I never heard her cry. I never heard intercession, only silence, as if she were waiting for someone to answer. It was exactly 3 days after this dream that the possession service took place. The timing matched. She prayed for revelation, dreamed of the answer, and then hell manifested and exposed everything on the altar. That couldn't be a coincidence. I began to observe Mal with different A's. She was quieter, but firm. She ran her hand through the anointed oil with a different conviction. She touched the walls of the house and whispered prayers. At first, I thought she was trying to expel something, but then I realized, perhaps she was calling. One day I snuck into the room. Underneath her bed was an old Bible, full of notes. Inside it was a folded piece of paper with a handwritten note: "When God's silence is too long, other voices respond." I froze. That could have been a warning or a confession or a warning, but it was clear she had realized that the God she had always sought might be taking too long to answer, and that other, more agile spirits were lurking. During smaller services, after the revelation, she went up to the altar to pray, something she hadn't done in years. She took the microphone with trembling hands and simply said, "The time of deception is over." And she stepped down. That was like a slap in the face. I froze. I began to have strange dreams about her. I dreamed she was wearing a black dress, walking down a dark hallway with a candle in her hand. Her eyes didn't blink, and she repeated the same phrase. I asked for justice. I woke up with a tachycardia, sweating. The house changed. It was as if there was a new presence inside, not the spirit of the covenant, not the same one that accompanied me. It was different, something colder, more intelligent, more patient, as if Marley had been heard, but not by heaven. She began to fast frequently, but she didn't eat just bread and water. She drank dark tea and burned leaves in the room. One night I went in and smelled a scent of rosemary mixed with a faint sulfur. She said it was smoking, but didn't explain why. When I tried to talk, she was direct. "Don't you want to know who I spoke to?" But he listened and answered. He said this, looking me in the eye, unblinking. I trembled. It wasn't a threat, it was a certainty. I began to have nightmares of her at the altar, preaching with the Bible open and a demon standing behind her, smiling. I woke up screaming. Marley came into bedroom, turned on the light, and said, "This is just the beginning." Then he left as if nothing had happened. I no longer knew who my wife was. She had always been discreet, submissive, a believer, but now she seemed like a priestess of a cult I didn't understand. I don't know if she wanted justice or revenge, but I knew someone had heard her, and that someone wasn't the God of the sermons I pretended to preach. That's when I realized the weight of her words. Marl's prayer had been heard, and hell answered promptly. It didn't all begin at the altar, nor at the pulpit, nor in the Bible. It began at a bookstall in the Osasco Municipal Market, among pastry stalls and a strong smell of raw fish. I still remember the sound of the TV playing a pirated Google DVD in the background, while I leafed through a used edition of The Intersection That Moves Heaven. I was confused back then. That was in mid was 1998. I wasn't a pastor yet. I held services at home, had a small prayer group, and dreamed of opening a ministry that was different from everything else. But honestly, I wanted to grow. I wanted a stage. I wanted a crowd. I wanted to be the man who brought fire. It was there that a man approached me, thin, tall, wearing a beige tunic and a turtleneck underneath. His name was Silas. He had a strange smile, seemingly drawn over his face, as if it were unnatural. "Are you hungry? Aren't you?" he asked. He didn't explain why, but I understood immediately. In the following days, he appeared in the places I frequented, at the bus terminal, on the sidewalk, in front of the bakery, always wearing the same outfit. One day, he approached me at the bus stop and said, "Joel, you won't be able to perform miracles with fasting and prayer alone. You need a spiritual push, whether you like it or not." That push pervaded me like music. I was frustrated. I had tried everything, campaigns, vigils, preaching in public squares, but nothing was happening. I wanted power, and Silas seemed to know this. He handed me a piece of paper with the address, Estrada do Pau Ferredo, Kosher, Sunday, 4 a.m., alone. When the day came, I went. I still remember the bitter taste of the coffee I drank before leaving. I drove my square white Golf for almost an hour to the road. It was a remote place, with tall trees, no lights, and a smell of wet earth mixed with the smoke of burning tires. Silas was waiting for me in a clearing. He had a cloth spread on the ground, black candles in a circle, a plate with flour and coagulated blood in the center, and a black rooster in a burlap sack that cried softly. I hesitated, but he simply said, "If you leave now, you'll go back to being nobody." He handed me a heavy, old bone-handled knife. He told me to repeat some words I didn't understand, something in Latin or something similar. The wind seemed to stop when I began to speak, the forest became more, the air was dense. The crickets fell silent, time stood still. I slit the rooster's neck with my trembling hand, blood splattered on my pants. Silas collected it in a cup and poured it into the flour dish, then he took my finger and made a small cut. A drop of it fell onto the mixture. "Now he knows your name," he said. When he finished, Silas handed me an envelope. Inside was a list, names of influential people in the city, contacts of salon owners, printers, merchants. "They will help you, they don't even know why, but they will." I log.